Welcome to a very special, very spooky episode of Sidebar, a podcast by Courthouse News. I'm your host, Josh Russell, and I'm joined today by a macabre and unholy figure.
Hey, Josh.
Oh, my mistake. That's just Courthouse News Los Angeles reporter Hillel Aaron.
And today we're going to be talking about one of the most illustrious inmates in 20th century American history, better known as the Birdman of Alcatraz. Though as we will see, he did not actually keep birds at Alcatraz. Before he died in 1963, Robert Stroud had thousands of admirers, many of whom would write letters to the president begging for him to be released.
There's an old black and white movie about that Birdman,
starring Burt Lancaster.
And it's a heartwarming piece of cinema about perseverance, old-school surliness, and the indomitability of the human spirit. I take it the actual Robert Stroud was a bit more complicated than the Burt Lancaster character?
Yeah, in reality, Stroud was a violent psychopath, a double murderer who showed no signs of remorse, humility, or rehabilitation.
But he really did raise birds in prison.
Yeah, that part's real. He raised and cared for hundreds of birds while he was in Leavenworth prison. And he wrote a number of articles and even a couple of books about bird disease, and he was pretty well respected in the field. And that incongruity, a violent prisoner caring for these pretty fragile and graceful animals, is what drew Hollywood to Stroud. But the gentler side of Stroud came to overshadow everything else in terms of how he was portrayed and how he is remembered.
So today we're going to look at the man behind the mask.
That's right. Now, I wanted to begin by introducing Jolene Babyak. Most of this episode is taken from her excellent book, Birdman, The Many Faces of Robert Stroud. And Babyak's father actually knew Stroud. He was a prison guard, first at Leavenworth and then at Alcatraz. And what's even more amazing is that Babyak actually lived on Alcatraz for a few years, between the ages of 7 and 9, and then again when she was 15. I spoke to her a few weeks ago.
It was magnificent for children. It was a very protected community. No one was ever hurt. I saw prisoners in the summertime when I wasn't in San Francisco at school. From a distance, a few outside workers. When I was a little kid, they used to wave at us from the trucks going by, and we would shyly wave back.
Even before the Burt Lancaster movie came out, Stroud was well known.
Phil Bergen, who was captain of the guards, he told me one time, he said, when you transferred prisoners, say from Lewisburg, Pennsylvania to Leavenworth, the guards would ask you two questions. Do you want to eat? And do you want to see the Birdman cell? And he said, of course you always wanted to eat. And you always wanted to see the Birdman cell. So he was famous among prison guards and everybody knew about it.
So he was famous both outside of prison and inside?
Yeah. Back then, prison wardens were patronage positions, doled out by the governor to friends and political allies. So the wardens were typically well-connected businessmen who wanted to keep their position, and they would give tours to try to suck up to various dignitaries. Anyway, the grand finale of these tours at Leavenworth would be Robert Stroud's prison cell, which was packed, floor to ceiling, with hundreds of birds in handmade bird cages.
That must have been cacophonous.
It was loud, and it also reeked. The floor was covered in cigarette butts and bird poop, and you could smell it from all the way down the hall. And so tourists would get to see Stroud, and his birds would sometimes do tricks. But the point of all this was to show that these prisoners, including a man who'd killed 2 people, could actually be rehabilitated.
Let's talk about Robert Stroud. Who is he, and what was his childhood like?
His childhood was not particularly happy, you'll be shocked to hear. Why don't you read what Stroud himself wrote about his father?
Sure. My father was a wastrel scion of a once wealthy and powerful Southern family, who through his devotion to slow horses, fast women, and red whiskey had accomplished the financial ruination of his family and reduced himself to the status of a day laborer before meeting my mother. So, a family in generational decline?
Right. His mother, Elizabeth, was one of 12 children. Here's Jolene Babyak talking about her.
She could be very cold, difficult person. She married poorly. 2 men who were said to be alcoholics, one of whom was Stroud's father, a very abusive alcoholic, and threatened to kill the family. Oftentimes the family had to flee. I mean, it was a horrible situation. So Stroud was growing up with an abusive father, a mother who was cold and could be manipulative. And when you did the wrong thing, she would consider you dead. She wouldn't look at you. And Stroud was a very bitter kid and apparently tried to kill his father when he was about 10, threw a rock at him and hit him in the chest and knocked him down, and threatened him because the father had threatened the family. So you're talking about a very disruptive family. He was sick a lot. He didn't go to school. He was starting to get into trouble. By the time he was 15, he was out on the street.
So he leaves home, and he essentially becomes a hobo. He's riding the rails and stealing whatever he can. And eventually he returns to Alaska, where his mother is living. And, he's shooting morphine. He's in and out of local jails. And by some accounts, he's also a pimp.
This figures into his first murder.
It does. Now, like the movie Rashomon, there are 3 versions of this killing. There's a woman named Kate. She goes by Kitty. And she's maybe Stroud's friend, maybe his lover, and maybe a prostitute under his employ.
Or some combination thereof.
Yeah. So one newspaper account states that a man named Charlie Von Dahmer had grown a bit too amorous of Kitty. Stroud's own account, which was later repeated by a number of writers, was that this guy Von Dahmer beat Kitty up.
Stroud writes, "A man she lived with years before I met her beat her up. My mother always taught me that a woman who is good enough to sleep with is good enough to protect. I took a pistol and blew his brains out."
Even in Stroud's own account, he's not exactly remorseful. Anyway, the third account is from the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, which claimed that Stroud was Kitty's pimp and that Von Dahmer only gave her $2 instead of the usual $10.
So he was murdered over $8.
This is in 1909 when Stroud is 19 years old. And after the shooting, he walks into the police station and he says, "I shot a man."
Why does he confess?
Stroud is a strangely honest guy, and part of that might be because maybe he was a psychopath. Here's Jolene again.
Psychopaths have a kind of a superior attitude. They think they're right and everyone else is wrong. Some of them who are dangerous often take like Stroud's response was, that man needed to be killed and I'm the man to do it.
Right.
And he thought he had a superior intelligence and a superior will, and he was bitter. He was quite bitter. And he was a predator from the very beginning.
Stroud also thought he could plead self-defense.
Yeah, but that doesn't work because Kitty flips on him, and Stroud ends up pleading guilty to manslaughter, for which he's sentenced to 20 years in prison. And he's sent to McNeil Island in Washington State.
What's it like there?
I mean, it's basically a dungeon. It's old, filthy, it has poor ventilation. It's freezing cold for half the year. You want to read what he wrote about it?
Sure. The gloom, the chill, the filth, the rutted floors, the stench of the night buckets, the silence, almost like that of a grave, fell up on my spirits and reduced them to the lowest point in my experience. I was frightfully lonely, rightfully miserable.
Now, in some ways, the rules at McNeil were pretty loose, as they were in a lot of prisons at the time. For example, inmates could have small pets like mice, rats, even birds, as we'll see later. Prisoners could also run their own businesses.
They could what?
Yeah. According to one of Stroud's books, an inmate he knew would gather crime stories from his fellow convicts, write them up, and then sell them to magazines. And another had a business making stuffed animals, which he was so successful at, he employed 5 other convicts.
Wow.
Also, visitors weren't monitored very closely, and they could basically bring inmates whatever they wanted.
That does not seem smart.
No, and a lot of drugs come into the prison, particularly morphine, which Stroud starts to sell.
And that leads to him getting in some trouble.
Yeah. In 1911, a fellow prisoner rats on him for dealing morphine, or at least that's what Stroud thinks. So Stroud stabs him 7 times with a penknife in the back. The inmate doesn't die, but Stroud is given another 6 months, and he's transferred to Leavenworth, a federal penitentiary in Kansas. It's a maximum security prison, so it's more strict. And the guards carry around these clubs with steel ends, and they are not shy about using them.
So it's a more brutal place.
But Stroud is a guy who likes to keep busy. He starts painting, and he starts to make greeting cards that he sends to his mother, who sells them for a bit of money. Stroud also starts taking correspondence courses.
Was he a smart guy?
He is smart, but he's poorly educated. When he first goes to prison, he's barely literate, so he starts reading a lot and studying math and something called theosophy, which was like this weird religious belief at the time that had elements of karma and past lives.
The Scientology of its day.
Right, the kooky, faux Eastern religion of its day. Anyway, despite keeping busy, Stroud starts to get very depressed and starts to think about killing himself. And probably the only thing that keeps him going is this overwhelming hatred he had for many of the people around him.
Especially the prison guards.
In 1916, Stroud's younger brother Marcus is in town, and he's supposed to visit the next day. But at dinner, Stroud talks to someone, which is against the rules. And part of the punishment is that he won't get to see visitors. So, the next day, Stroud confronts one of the guards named Andrew Turner, and it becomes very heated. Turner, who's in his mid-20s, reaches for his steel-tipped club. Stroud reaches into his shirt and pulls out a knife and plunges it into Turner's heart. The whole altercation lasts maybe 20 seconds, and within 18 minutes, Turner is dead.
And does Stroud feel guilty at all?
Not at all. In fact, the murder pulls Stroud out of his depression. And at his trial, he says, quote, "A feeling came to me of courage that I had absolutely nothing to fear." And his lawyer asks, "What about your conscience?" And Stroud goes, "That does not bother me." "Why not?" the lawyer asks. "Because I don't see where I've committed any moral wrong in that case." After the second murder, his mother, Elizabeth, who's 59, packs up and moves to Kansas. She hires a lawyer and tells him that her son is going to plead insanity. Stroud doesn't love the idea, but he agrees. And when he testifies during the trial, he starts blathering on about all this stuff he learned from Theosophy, about the Master of Agura and Davos of Carmen. The prosecutors aren't buying any of this. They say, if he's so crazy, why didn't he plead insanity during his last trial? The jury agrees, finds him guilty, and Stroud is sentenced to hang. But the judge in the trial made an error. He never instructed the jury that they could vote to convict without the death penalty. Stroud appeals the verdict. I mean, at this point, it's Stroud's mother who's calling all the legal shots. They appeal the verdict, and they win.
So there's a new trial. How does that one go?
Not that different. He drops his insanity plea. This time he argues self-defense. He's convicted again, but he's sentenced to life in prison. And again, the Strouds appeal.
What's the issue they raise this time?
Back then, inmates were not allowed to testify during trials. So to get around this law, prosecutors got 5 prisoners who witnessed Stroud stabbing the prison guard, and they pardoned them as they were walking into the courtroom.
Wow. And of course, Stroud couldn't exactly do that with his own witnesses.
Exactly. So the appeal goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court this time, which rules in favor of Stroud. And this also sets a precedent. From now on, prisoners can testify in court.
So then there's a third trial.
But this time the prison guards change their stories. They play down the idea that Turner was about to hit Stroud. The jury deliberates for less than an hour before they come out and find Robert Stroud guilty, and they sentence him to death. The Strouds appeal, but this time they lose, and Stroud's execution is set for April 1920.
But
Elizabeth has one option left. She writes a letter to the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who's actually recently had a stroke and he's bedridden. And his wife, Edith, is making all the decisions for him. But the President's secretary is moved by Elizabeth Stroud's letter. And he tells Edith, look, let's do this for the mother, for all the sacrifices she's made. Edith Wilson says, okay, and signs the commutation order, and Stroud is resentenced to life in prison. Now, prison officials are not happy. And right away, they decide if they can't execute Stroud, they're going to do the next best thing and throw him into solitary confinement indefinitely. So Stroud is thrown into what's called segregation in Leavenworth. We're going to use these terms interchangeably, segregation, solitary, and isolation, and those can mean different things at different prisons. But what we mean is it's a special section of the prison where the inmates have their own cells, they eat alone, they might get 30 minutes of exercise a day in the yard alone, and they might get 1 shower a week.
Jolene Babyak writes, the cells were large and stark, without furniture or fixtures.
Yeah, these cells are for the worst prisoners, the ones who tried to escape and the ones who are mentally ill. And in most of the cells, the toilets have actually been broken, so there's just a small drain on the floor for going to the bathroom. And this is where Stroud will stay for 21 years. At first, he just passes the time smoking cigarettes, studying, painting, and pacing. Until, one day, he's in the prison yard, and he sees a fallen nest with a pair of baby sparrows. He takes the two birds in, starts to hand feed them, first with prison food and then with insects.
And this wasn't that unusual?
No, as we said, other prisoners had pets, and for years he just had these pet birds. And then one day they get sick. One of them dies, but Stroud gives the other one some dirt to eat or something like that, which seems to make them better. And thus begins an obsession, really, for raising and caring for birds. Stroud gets a canary and builds this bird cage out of a wooden soapbox. Then he starts breeding canaries, which are pretty popular pets at the time. His mother visits every Sunday and takes the birds away in cages and sells them. He starts selling his own mix of bird seed, and then he branches out into breeding pedigreed birds. He sells something called a fancy pedigreed Gluck roller. And a few years later, there's this amazing anecdote in Babyak's book. J. Edgar Hoover buys a yellow canary from Stroud to give to J. Edgar Hoover's mother. But the bird starts to molt, and the Hoovers suspect that Stroud has simply taken a common sparrow and dyed it yellow.
Amazing. So this is around the time that Stroud is like the grand finale on the warden's prison tours.
Right. And because of that, Stroud starts to ask for things. He asks for more birds, more bird seed, more supplies for cages. Then he gets special food cooked for his birds. He even gets alcohol to clean the cages, which really he doesn't do all that often. He gets pretty much everything he asks for. At one point, he even manages to get a second cell.
Really?
Yeah, and Leavenworth by now is horribly overcrowded. It was built to hold 1,600 inmates. There's like 3,300 inmates there right now. People are sleeping on cots, in the basement, in hallways. But somehow Stroud gets a second cell right next to his other cell, and they punch a hole through the wall.
He's got a suite.
It's like a prison suite, and it's packed floor to ceiling with bird cages. By now, his business is booming. He claims that in one 3-month period, he makes $900 from selling baby birds. Although many of his birds are dying of disease, probably from poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. One Christmas, there's an outbreak, and 100 out of 160 of his birds die from something he calls septic fever.
Aw.
Yeah, and it must have been heartbreaking for him. I think he really must have loved those birds.
It's like The Sopranos, where Tony is this heartless sociopath but loves ducks and horses.
Well, and Stroud basically writes as much in his second book.
He writes, I have killed birds when it was almost as hard as killing one's own children. I have had birds die in my hand when their death brought me greater sadness than I ever felt over the passing of a member of my species.
So Stroud starts reading up on bird diseases, and actually very little is known about it at the time. There's one book that talks about a major disease called decline and recommends feeding spiders to birds or placing a rusty nail in their drinking water. Another book reads, as a rule, when a bird becomes sick, the best policy is to kill it. But Stroud is undeterred, and he starts to perform autopsies on his dead birds.
With what?
He says he did them with his fingers, but he also might have gotten a scalpel at some point. Anyway, he starts to experiment, and he ends up inventing a sort of bird medicine. It's a mixture of sodium perborate, citric acid, and salt. Eventually, he'll start marketing this stuff as Stroud's Specific and selling it for $2 a bottle. And he starts to write articles about his discoveries in bird journals.
Were his bird findings legit? Did the cures work?
I think some of his advice might have been okay, at least for the time, but a lot of it was just quackery. Stroud Specific was basically an antiseptic, which might work on a bacterial infection, but would have no effect on a virus or a parasite.
So Stroud was smart, but not as smart as he thought he was.
I think that's right. He had no medical training, and he was often grouping different symptoms almost at random. But if you had pet birds, and you loved them, and they got sick, there was nowhere else you could go. Robert Stroud was the only person doing this kind of research. And because of that, he developed a following. People started writing him letters. Here's Jolene again.
Some of his recommendations were pretty good, given the times. Others were just, hogwash, but no one knew anything about birds in those days. And then people would write letters to him. And they'd say, well, my bird has this disease and that disease. And he wrote a book, which his first book came out in 1933. And depression, no one bought it. He blamed his publisher, but it was probably because There was a depression raging out there, and no one bought the book.
Do Stroud's fans know he's a murderer?
Not yet, but that will change very soon. So by now it's the 1930s. We have prohibition, bootlegging, and we also have the FBI. Both McNeil and Leavenworth are put under the control of the Bureau of Prisons, whose first director is a man named James Bennett.
Bennett was a bureaucrat, but he was a good one. He had a lot of sympathy for his prisoners, and he did a lot of public speaking about the need to improve state prisons because they were not yet well organized, and many states didn't have a lot of money, and there was a lot of abuse, and they were sprawling campuses and, often in swamps. And so he did a lot of public speaking about the need to improve prisons and the need to give men jobs.
And Bennett sends out this memo declaring that from now on, inmates are forbidden from running businesses. And Stroud is told that he has to get rid of his birds. But Stroud won't give up without a fight. He has this woman who he's been sort of involved with. It's complicated. There's a woman who publishes an article in one of these bird journals, and it's probably written by Stroud. But the article says, hey, this guy, Robert Stroud, that you all love, he's actually a prison inmate, and the government is trying to take away his birds. And she urges all of Stroud's fans to write letters. Here's Jolene again, speaking about the fans.
It was mostly women. In those days, they were housewives and they had birds, there were some men in there too, but it was mostly people that thought that there was an injustice. People don't understand the difference between your emotional life and your intellectual. You can be very bright and emotionally screwed up.
So Stroud now becomes kind of like a regional celebrity. Newspapers write stories about this bird-keeping inmate, and they kind of soft pedal his crimes. And actually, a lot of the myths around Stroud begin with these early newspaper articles. Letters start to pour into Leavenworth, to the Bureau of Prisons, to Congress, even to the president. People think Stroud should be released, or at least he should get to keep his birds. First, Bennett tries to make a deal with Stroud. Here's Jolene again.
They were going to try to turn Stroud's business into, I guess this must have been around 36 or 37. They were going to try to turn Stroud's business into an industrial shop and make him part of industries. And Stroud wasn't going to have anything of this. And so they met under those conditions. And Stroud didn't, again, he had the superior attitude and he needed an enemy. And Bennett became his enemy. Bennett himself kept a knife in his drawer that he would apparently pull out every once in a while and show it to his visitors and tell people that this was Stroud's knife that was meant to kill him. So the two of them, had this thing going for many, many years.
Eventually, prison officials back down, and Stroud gets to keep his birds and the business.
Stroud later writes, "For 11 years, I enjoyed the confidence of prison officials to such an extent that I actually had tons of bird seed." He says he had so many boxes, quote, "I could have, had I cared to do so, had Tommy guns and cases of explosives shipped into the insertions," end quote. And Babyak quotes a prison guard as saying, "Without a doubt, this man had more privileges than any prisoner in Leavenworth history."
Yeah, and in fact, years later, when he's transferred to Alcatraz and they clean out his cell, guards discover that hiding within this mass of bird cages, bookshelves, and scientific equipment is a burgeoning moonshining business and letter kiting scheme. He later boasts to officers that he has been making 188 proof grain alcohol for 12 years. Officers also found other contraband, including a stiletto-like dagger.
So when does Stroud go to Alcatraz?
All right, it's 1942. Stroud is 52 years old. He's been in prison for 33 years, nearly two-thirds of his life. The U.S. is now at war with Germany and Japan, and there's a prison guard shortage because everyone is joining up with the army. And Leavenworth simply doesn't have the manpower to deal with Stroud and his many demands. So one night, he's visited by a pair of prison guards, and he's informed that he's been transferred to Alcatraz.
Just like that. And is he allowed to keep his birds?
No.
What happens to them?
I don't actually know.
What was Alcatraz like?
It's a prison on an island in San Francisco Bay for our many international listeners. It had actually been a military prison starting in the 1850s, and then it became a federal prison in the 1930s. And it was used for inmates who caused trouble. And it starts to get a lot of bank robbers like Machine Gun Kelly, as well as gangsters like Al Capone. And when Stroud arrives, he's taken right to D Block, to segregation.
Solitary.
Right.
So if he can't raise birds, what does he do in prison all day?
He reads, he writes, and he litigates. Within 6 months of arriving in Alcatraz, he files a writ of habeas corpus, challenging the order that he be kept in solitary confinement. He loses that petition, in part because his treatment at Leavenworth was actually pretty good. Later in 1950, he sues the warden for intercepting his letters. He loses and then appeals. The appeals court dismisses the appeal and writes that it should, quote, not be compelled to listen to such nonsense. But Stroud still has his admirers, and some of them donate money to help him get his second book published. That happens in 1943. It's called Stroud's Digest on the Diseases of Birds. The dedication is kind of amazing. Do you want to read it?
Sure. To all my friends who by kindness or encouragement have aided in making this work possible, and to all of my enemies, whose mean, little, or thieving souls, actuated by bigotry, jealousy, spite, sadism, vindictiveness, or ignorance, have taken such keen delight. Should I keep going?
No, I think that's fine. It goes on for a while longer, and it's just incredible how driven he is by his hatred and his spite of all these people. Anyway, his second book, it's a much longer and stranger book than his first. It's not really edited, and it has all these weird asides like, quote, much of our craving for drink, narcotic drugs, and even swing music is traceable directly to our overfed diet of steam-cooked and processed food.
So ahead of his time in that respect.
Yeah, but the book actually gets good reviews, and Babyak writes that it, quote, would stand alone in the avian veterinary field for almost 20 years.
But only because there's nothing better.
Right. Babyak also writes that nearly every medical recommendation in the book was fallacious. Now, there's one incident we need to talk about, and it happens at Alcatraz, in which Stroud plays really only a tangential role. In 1946, there's a prison riot, and a couple of prisoners get their hands on some guns, and they open the doors of D Block, and the military is called in, and there's a 2-day siege. And at one point, troops are shooting into the prison, and shrapnel is flying into the cells, killing prisoners. And Stroud heroically climbs down, risks his life to close the solid doors of a bunch of cells, shielding the other inmates from shrapnel. He then yells out and tries to get everyone to stop shooting, telling them that there are no firearms in D Block.
How do you square such heroism with the claim that Stroud is a remorseless psychopath?
I don't know, other than to say human beings are complicated.
He had another side of him. He was very protective of his sister, who was cognitively disabled. He was dismissive of his brother because he thought he was, ineffectual. But he tended to protect people that he thought had no other protection. And it was a matter of control. So he had these two sides to him, the guy who was a predator and then the guy who wanted to protect people.
When does Hollywood first get interested?
First, there's this film producer named Richard Palomar, who's also an avid bird enthusiast, and he writes a letter to Stroud. But the letter gets returned because Stroud can't actually receive mail at Alcatraz. That makes Palomar think, well, this would be a pretty good movie. So Palomar writes to Stroud's brother Marcus and said, we should make a movie about your brother. Marcus writes to Robert, and his response is great. He says, quote, I have taken 4 luminols, that's a sedative, since reading your letter, and I am still so excited that I can't sit still. Yes, Mark, this looks like the money.
So Stroud is excited about the idea of having a movie made about him.
Yeah, I think he wants to be famous, and he thinks that this will get him a pardon. But someone who does not want this movie made is James Bennett, who's still the head of the Bureau of Prisons and still hates Stroud. So he calls the producer and invites him to Washington to read Stroud's file. That's enough to convince Palomar that Stroud is a, quote, vicious murderer and a, quote, bad egg.
So he doesn't do the film?
No, but one day, a writer named Tom Gaddis reads about Stroud. Gaddis is actually a former probation officer, and he's looking for a good story, and he reads about Robert Stroud. He asks permission to visit Stroud, but he's denied. And that just makes Gaddis think he's onto something.
What are they hiding?
Right. So he writes an article for Cosmopolitan magazine called The Birdman of Alcatraz. And this is the first national magazine story about Stroud, so it's a big deal. Then Marcus Stroud gets in touch with Gaddis and sends him nearly 4,000 letters to and from Robert, and another 1,800 written to him by his mother, siblings, and fans. And I was really surprised by this, but according to Babyak's book, Marcus paid Tom Gaddis $2,400 to turn the Cosmo article into a book.
So it's basically a PR fluff job.
Nevertheless, when the book comes out in 1955, it's an enormous success.
Gaddis writes on the first page, "Prison in the Arabian phrase is engraved on his eyeballs. He has been kept in isolation for 42 years, longer than any federal prisoner in history."
Which I don't think is completely accurate.
But it was good writing.
I think so, certainly for the time. Here's Jolene talking about the book.
In the 50s, every kid read Birdman of Alcatraz. It truly was a bestseller. I mean, this was a pocketbook and everybody read it. And so, it was very romantic, very romantic. And Gaddis met Stroud once and he was, overjoyed to meet him, like a fanboy. But the book, of course, was very romantic.
What did Stroud think of the finished book?
He never read it. He wasn't allowed to read books about crime. But he does make some money off of it once the lawsuit is settled. But despite the book's popularity, Stroud loses his bid for clemency, and he's denied parole again. The chair of the parole board personally visited Stroud in 1958, and later wrote that he was convinced that Stroud was trying to hypnotize him by, quote, weaving back and forth like a pendulum, with a deliberately hypnotic tone of voice. But he does, however, finally get out of solitary confinement when he's transferred out of Alcatraz to a medical center in Missouri. It's much nicer than Alcatraz. He writes in one letter, "You can imagine what a pleasure it was to me to lie on the grass for the first time since 1914. He sees his first television set. He eats meals with other people for the first time in about half a century. He has access to news, telephones, a radio. He's given a job in the library." One report writes that he is somewhat of a hero to other inmates, yet treats them in a patronizing manner.
So he's still an arrogant jerk.
Yeah. Old age has not made him a nice person. The other inmates mostly dislike him, partly because he has horrible manners, he eats with his fingers, and he boasts openly of being a pedophile. And he never shuts up. One inmate said, "He talked so continuously I could hardly get a word in edgewise." Meanwhile, Hollywood has been busy adapting Tom Gaddis's book into a major motion picture, directed by John Frankenheimer and starring Burt Lancaster as Robert Stroud. Have you seen the movie, Josh?
Yeah, I watched it on YouTube.
Did you like it?
Oh, it was cool, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's very long. It's a little slow. Lancaster is great, I think. And I do think the movie captures something about Stroud, especially in the beginning when he's just burning with this indignation and superiority.
Oh, yeah, he's surly for sure, but he softens pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's a scene very early on in which a prison guard, who's always been very nice to Stroud, gets angry at him. Let's play that clip.
Well, you get this, bucko. I may be just a uniform to you, but you've got no patent on feelings. I'm a man, the same as you, and I want to be treated like one. So from here on out, you'd better come up with a few manners with me. Or don't even expect the time of day from yours truly.
You know what I think, Bull?
I don't give a damn what you think.
I think you're absolutely right. I admire you for sounding off like that. You always treated me square. You've been good to me. So there's something I want to do. I want to apologize to you. I ain't apologized to anybody in 20 years.
So then Stroud is like, well, I guess you're right. I will be a nice person.
Yeah, in the film, the birds give him humanity.
Right, which I don't think actually happened in real life.
And he's straight in the movie.
Right, and he's certainly not writing graphic fantasies about abusing children in his spare time. So the film was released in 1962. Millions of people see it. It's nominated for Academy Awards, although it doesn't win any. And there's a big publicity tour, part of which is to talk about what a great guy Robert Stroud is and what an injustice it is that he's still in solitary confinement. And again, there's this huge disparity between the public perception of Stroud and the view that prison guards and fellow inmates had. Because on the one hand, newspaper columnists and Hollywood actors and bird owners are all lobbying for Stroud to be released. Meanwhile, according to one attorney general, Stroud was asked what he would do when he got out of prison, and Stroud replies that he wanted, quote, to kill a number of others on the list, and he had so short a time.
Not really what you want to be saying out loud.
No. By now, Stroud's health is really starting to fail. He's always diagnosing himself with weird ailments that the doctors don't believe. And in the end, he's a very bitter man. He tells people that his mother caused all his problems and that prison made him into a pedophile. Burt Lancaster actually got to meet Stroud in Springfield. Here he is talking about it on the Dick Cavett Show in 1969.
A very strange man, very bitter, of course, about the entire penal system, which somehow or other failed to recognize his very unique and very special and wonderful talents. And but the head of it was a prison hospital, and the head of the hospital, the warden, who was also a public health officer, told me that that Stroud, they didn't expect him to live throughout the year. He had a chronic liver ailment, brought about, I dare say, by the alcohol that he used to mix in his cell, and whatever the reasons were. He died very shortly thereafter and was never freed. He could have been free, but he was a man of a unique and independent spirit. He didn't want to be under any sort of probationary rule. He felt that he wanted to go out, that he had, as it were, paid his society for what he had done, and he wanted no strings attached to that kind of freedom.
In November 1963, Stroud has a heart attack, and 3 days later he dies peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, having spent 54 years in federal prison.
Stroud, he led quite a life.
Yeah, and I think it's a rare case where the real-life criminal was much scarier than the movie version. Why don't we close with you reading how Babyak ends her book?
In the end, the real Robert Stroud was much more fascinating than either the book or the movie portrayed. He was far more complicated, intense, diabolical, perverse, deadlier, and funnier.
Much like yourself, Josh.
Thanks, buddy. That's where we'll wrap it up today.
Yeah, and many thanks to Jolene Babyak.
And to you, the listener, have a very happy Halloween. Next time on Sidebar, reporter Kirk McDaniel on the future of campaign finance law. Does the candidate with the bigger war chest always win? And what will elections look like when donations hit the 9-figure mark? It's an episode you won't want to miss, especially if your pockets aren't very deep. See you then.